I think positioning a product we have already discussed, and most of you will know these introductory slides, so I'll just skip through it, is how to differentiate yourself in the mind of the prospect, right? And in order to check the positioning, I think the simplest thing that you can do is you can see what people are talking about you and why they are talking about you. If somebody is telling about this growth catalyst session to somebody else, what are they saying? Are they saying that this is a good kind of set of essays on growth, and then there is a kind of Q&A session or online session? Or are they saying that this is something which somebody is writing as a hobby and the depth is not there and all that, right? So what people talk about your product actually defines your positioning. And this is a simple framework, right? I think 4 Ps of marketing we all have read. And this is something that is not often discussed. But how to do it, how to do the positioning exercise is you start with the research. RSTP is what you should remember. You start with the research because different customers have different needs and different paying capacity. So you start with understanding what are the needs of different customers, what is the paying capacity of different customers. You then try to segment people based on these needs and paying capacity. And then what you're trying to find is who are the underserved segments. So for example, if I take an example of why I started Growth Catalyst, I saw that folks in India, right? They want to learn growth. They want to learn growth to apply in marketing and product management, but they can't afford a $3,000 course, which talks almost the same thing that you can find in blogs and everywhere, right? So my point was, why not start something which is a longer duration kind of course, but which does not include a lot of any kind of paying from people, because there are people who don't want to pay, but they still want to learn, right? Uh, and they don't want to pay exorbitant fees, right? So then you segment this, then the target is you guys, right? And hopefully, I think the positioning was there, and it will change over time as I write more and more essays. And if the essays are good, if the sessions are good, I think the positioning will keep changing, keep getting better for the target audience. So RSTP is what I want you to remember, right? Uh, a simple example was smartphones discussed in one of the essays. Like smartphone is a category in which you can see a lot of like entry level phones, like 8 to 10,000. And Xiaomi, Redmi is something which leads the category there. Then you go into mid-range and you see OnePlus series. Then you go to premium and you have Samsung Galaxy and all. And then luxury is iPhone, right? So all of these are smartphones. I think in terms of functionality, they are almost the same, right? But people have different needs, different preferences. Some people are taking an iPhone because of status symbol it kind of represents, right? And some people are very utilitarian and they go for a mid-range phone. So I think needs, preferences, RSTP, right? And you can analyze any market using this framework. Now, I think we also discussed golden rules of positioning, right? It's better to be first than it is to be better. I think since my college days, people have been talking about first mover advantage. When I did my first startup, I think our pitch was we are the first movers in this. So first mover advantage is very, very, I would say even cliched, right? Then there is another rule, which is if you can't be first in a category because the world has been around here for 13 billion years, then create a new category, right? And you don't need to create a new product to create a new product, new category. You just need to change the pricing, packaging, and positioning well, right? Then the third was, if there is a competition that is existing, just reposition them. Doing some dirty tactics in the past, like people have done that. I wouldn't advise that ethically and morally, but you can still reposition the competition. And I have added the word subtly because I think the subtle thing is still something that people will be comfortable with, which even you will be comfortable with, even morally and ethically, right? Then people have told in positioning that if you want to win a category, go with a new name. Unless you are working on a commodity product like salt, like Tata Salt is there. Tata can launch some new butter kind of category, and they will call it Tata Butter because Tata has its brand name, and they can extend that into commodities, right? Or if you're going for a low volume, like you want to launch it, but you don't want it to win a category because you know that there are already category winners and you don't have any ideas on how to kind of reposition them or how to find holes in them and create a new category. So you're like, okay, we are fine with low volume, but we can get like 5 to 10% of this market, and we are happy with that, right? Or in case of enterprise products, because the decision-making cycle is very different from consumer B2C, right? In B2B or enterprise products, what happens is people are much more rational. The decision cycle is very long, and they are going to evaluate you on very, very rational parameters, like what is the pricing, what are the features they are offering, and all those things, right? So B2B folks in the audience will relate to me when I say that positioning, I think almost 90% of literature around positioning is not relevant to them. Now the problem is software products. I think software businesses, not a lot has been written around positioning because in software businesses, all these rules kind of break. Okay. So you first learn these rules and then you learn how these break, right? So software businesses are fundamentally different because there is low cost of production of software. I can build an app today, like in my weekend, right? So barriers of entry to build something is very low. This is unlike hardware products where you need a lot of R&D, you need a lot of machines to build something. Like I remember my days, like early days in the first startup we did in college, it took us 1.5 years to build a hardware prototype. Like we were trying to build a solar panel. So the low cost of production of software is something which reduces the barriers to entry. The marginal cost of production is zero, which means that I can distribute my content or my software to like thousands of people, hundred thousands of people. The marginal cost is almost zero because there might still be some server cost and everything, but it is negligible compared to what you can get out of it, right? The third is earlier in hardware cases, there are a lot of storefronts, but now the storefront has reduced to my smartphone. So this is just my one smartphone and everybody is trying to get my attention through it, right? So this is the only storefront that is there. And the fourth one is this storefront, the good thing that has happened, and which is why a lot of people are able to survive in software business is this is available to me 24/7, right? Which means that I can even spend like 15, 16 hours of my day on this, right? So software businesses are fundamentally different from the literature that was written in 1970s, 80s, right? And which is why we have to bring in additional parameters. And I would actually thank one of my friends, Kamal. He is a graduate of Columbia Business School. He actually told me that why don't you kind of think around software businesses, because these are not applying like something like network effects is not covered in positioning exercises. So thanks, Kamal, for that. But if you think around it, right, the additional parameters can be classified into 3 or 4 things. One is the network effects, which means that think of it like a telephone. So the more people are there on telephone network, the much better it becomes for a user. And the harder it becomes for the user to move out of that telephone network. Because if my uncle, my aunt, my parents are on the same telephone network, I cannot move out of it. And that is called network effect. It makes the product better for the user, which means that I can telephone anybody and I can talk to them. But it also makes the switching cost very harder because you have to switch the whole network out of that platform. And if you think this is leading to demand aggregators like Facebook, TikTok, because on Facebook, I'm connected to everybody. TikTok does not have that huge network effect, but more of a like all the creators are there. So all the people are also going there to entertain themselves. It's very too hard once it hits a critical mass. Second is demand supply matching, right? So demand supply matching is what Uber is all about. And this is happening in real time. Earlier also you used to call somebody, they used to send a bus or a cab to your home, but now it has become real time, right? So that has changed the entire dynamics. The software updates can happen in real time. Data has become a moat, which means that Spotify recommendation engine you cannot build in one day. That is something of an IP, and it's very hard to build because Spotify has all the data and all the data rights for the users, right? So these are the additional parameters. I think network effects, demand supply matching in real time, software updates in real time, data network effects have kicked in, and which has changed the whole thing in a very different manner. So now when you are analyzing positioning, I would say think around these lines also when you are analyzing software businesses. Coming to the next part where I will spend 15 minutes on 3 case studies, 5 minutes each. I have tried to cover the B2B marketplaces. I have tried to cover the B2C marketplaces. And then I also made a very different point in this, particular session, that you have to reposition your competition subtly. So I have tried to cover that also. So 3 case studies, and then that will be followed by something I know a lot of people have joined for, which is like how to position your career. So first is B2B marketplaces, right? So B2B marketplaces, if you see, there are two kind of platforms. One is the horizontal platforms, like platforms where any business can go, they can list themselves and other businesses can find them. So something like a Udaan or IndiaMart. So IndiaMart is around 20 years old. So most of you will know that. Udaan is just 3 to 4 years old, right? Now, these are very generically positioned, right? They're catering to everybody, which is why it is easier to find holes. And we'll come to that later. Vertical platforms are catering to a single category, like Zumbotail, Ninjacart. Ninjacart is going for fresh produce and all. Zumbotail is trying to serve to retailers, right? So I think what you realize is even like horizontal B2B marketplaces, what has happened is IndiaMart started with a classifieds model, and it actually has the 60% of B2B classified space on its platform, right? It mostly helps with all the classifieds. Actually, I worked in housing also. All the classifieds work to solve the pricing and discovery problem. Now, as the tech has evolved, it has become easier to kind of get people's data, give them some lending, even automate logistics for them, right, in real time. So which is where Udaan found a very good hole in this in this market. And they entered by saying that we will give you pricing and discovery for free, but we will charge you for transactions, we'll charge you for credit interest, we'll charge you for logistics, right? So what you see is a very clear case of how Udaan entered into a very different positioning, and it has raised I think, around $1 billion, right? I don't remember the exact numbers, but it is valued more than $3 billion. And it has actually grown very well, right? Now let's come to the other part of it, right? So both of these products, the question becomes, will Udaan actually kill IndiaMart? And the answer that I have right now, based on our positioning analysis, I'm not sure. Because what you realize is both have very different positioning. IndiaMart is good for people who just want to find a lot of businesses to do business with, right? And they're willing to pay a subscription fee for that. Whereas Udaan is focused on people who want logistics and who want credit and all these things. And if you see their market, the market in which they are market leaders or category leaders, it becomes even more clearer. IndiaMart is actually focused on metros and large cities where logistics and credit is not that big a problem. Whereas Udaan ka turnover comes from tier 2, tier 3 cities, because people who are using logistics and credit are from tier 2, tier 3 cities. I think those are the small businesses who need credit lines and everything, right? Who also don't have a sorted logistics network, right? And this is a very beautiful case study. And I know both will try to jump into each other areas. Udaan has actually kind of challenged IndiaMart by saying that pricing and discovery are free, right? So both will actually try to go head on, but it will actually, they can only coexist if they actually maintain their different positioning, right? Vertical B2B marketplaces, I love vertical B2B marketplaces. And the reason is across the value chain, right? Like across the value chain, you can see for Ninjacart, they have covered everything, which means that it's very hard to, it's very hard to optimize costs better than them because they are operating in a single vertical. It's very hard to do end-to-end integration for Udaan into this market. They also have very deep knowledge of customers, right? So all of this makes the switching cost and everything very hard. Same is the case for Bizongo. Bizongo, I think all the founders are my friends. So I'm putting the disclaimer out there. So Bizongo actually started as a B2B marketplace, trying to disrupt kind of IndiaMart, and it was a very, very big, ambitious goal. And they realized the benefit of positioning. And now they have positioned themselves everything packaging. And if you see, there is nobody who is challenging their status quo. And in a couple of years or a few years down the line, we can see a good platform in packaging emerging from this. Jumbo Tail is another example, but you already get the gist, right? Jumbo Tail is trying to go for wholesale food and grocery. They're trying to build end-to-end integration. The good thing about vertical B2B marketplaces is it's very easy to kind of create that moat that startups strive for, right? It's very hard to poke holes into a vertical B2B marketplace because you are trying to solve the problem end to end. It's very hard for you to miss anything because you have a very deep knowledge of customers. So that's around B2B. Coming to B2C marketplaces, right? B2C marketplaces, let's look at on-demand food delivery in US, which is more evolved than India. I actually covered India in the positioning essay, but so I wanted to pick something different. In US, you can see how things have moved to actually see how things might move or will move in India, right? So in US in 2004, Grubhub happened. Remember that smartphones were not there yet. Postmates started in 2011. Smartphones were actually becoming growing at a fast pace. 13 DoorDash and 14 Uber Eats. Now 14 Uber Eats was more of a brand extension of Uber, right? And we have talked about brand extension, where they work, where they don't work, right? Now, this is how the market share looks like, right? DoorDash is leading the market despite it starting I think it started in 2013, right? Grubhub is still maintaining the 23-24% market share in last 2 years. Uber Eats has actually grown, but not so much. Like it's trending around 18 to 22% if you see across the years, right? Postmates is again not doing very well, whereas Postmates started in 2011. So what happened, right? That's a question. What happened with, what did DoorDash did do, which others could not, right? And the answer is, again, because we are talking about positioning, it's about positioning, right? So if people who have read the essays, I think they'll remember that there are two key things that you evaluate when you are looking at a market. One is how fast is market growing. Two is how fast is the tech changing, right? If the market is growing very fast and if the tech is changing slowly, think about smartphones. When they came in 2011, they haven't evolved much after, because in case of these apps, you just need real-time location tracking and everything. Uber had already solved that. So after 2011, not much of the tech that is required for these have changed, right? So when it comes to market growing very fast, because people started getting comfortable with food delivery and all, the whole market has actually moved up, if you see, right? The whole market has grown from 100 to around 4x in last 2 years. Then what matters is cash and distribution. And there's no tech differentiator. So cash and distribution actually matters. And that is where first mover advantage also matters. First mover advantage, especially with cash. And if you see DoorDash, right, they are live in 4,000 towns. Uber Eats is live in 500 and others are even in lesser ones. The reason is DoorDash actually focused a lot on suburbs. Like they went to tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, whereas other ones started fighting in tier 1, right? And one of the holes in positioning is actually location, geography. Like if somebody is not, if some category is not present in a particular geography, and if you go there first, you have a first mover advantage, provided you can capture the market very quickly and there are no tech changes which are happening fast. So that was the first thing. And the second was cash, right? SoftBank actually invested in DoorDash. So they have a war chest from SoftBank and they're burning it heavily. Only time will tell how this is going to pay off after the WeWork fiasco and after the Uber fiasco. But yeah, it remains to be seen what happens. But in terms of market and positioning, I think DoorDash has a significant advantage right now as compared to the competitors. Next is China's e-commerce, right? So this is my favorite case study, actually. I keep quoting this because if you see, China was all about two players for last 15 years, like JD.com, Alibaba.com, they had the entire market to them. It's like how Flipkart and Amazon are today in India's market. It's very difficult to see if somebody will come and topple the duopoly, right? And fast forward to 2019, 4 years, and Pinduoduo had higher number of daily active and total active users compared to the second largest platform, which is JD.com. They're still behind Alibaba, but not by a far margin, right? And the reason it happened again, right, is they segmented and targeted China's underserved population. Like they went to tier 2, tier 3 cities, and they said that if you can do group buying, you can get lower prices. So they started with grocery, where they said that, okay, grocery is available for 1/10 of price because this whole thing will be spoiled by tomorrow, right? And people actually jumped to that. They started there. They actually dominated the tier 2, tier 3, and they also banked heavily on shareability, right? They built some constructs like you can invite your friends who can actually lower the price of an item for you. So all they have to do is they just have to click lower the price, lower the price, lower the price. They don't have to buy anything. And this actually caught, this is actually viral if you think of it, right? So they did that very well. And if you're from tier 2, tier 3, you would not find it very difficult to imagine that if we ask people in tier 2, tier 3 to share something with their friends, they share it immediately. And especially if there is an economic incentive involved, it actually becomes viral. Think of all the WhatsApp messages on different groups that you receive, right? People don't think twice before sharing anything. So they actually kind of started in an underserved market, price sensitive market, and they moved ahead, right? And they have also engaged the audience through entertainment. Like they like to call themselves Costco plus Disneyland, right? Uh, I cannot go into a deeper analysis here, but maybe I'll write about this in some of the future posts. The side effects are also there. So they are seen as a spammy app in tier 1 cities, which means that their positioning and their penetration will actually be affected in tier 1 cities. Also, their brand image has become cheap, right? So they have become the second largest platform in China. They have gotten a valuation of $100 billion, but their brand image has become cheap. So over time, I think they will do different campaigns to move that brand image to tier 1 cities and metro cities also. But yeah, we'll see that. So this is the second one. The third one is repositioning subtly. So I have taken two examples 20 years apart. The first one is Apple's Macintosh commercial. I'm going to play this. Okay.
Today we celebrate the first glorious anniversary of the information purification directives. For the first time in all history, a garden of pure ideology, where each worker may bloom, secure from the pests, obeying contradictory rules. Education, of course, is a more powerful a weapon than any fleet or army on earth. We are one people, one will, one resolve, one cause. Our enemies shall talk themselves to death, and we will bury them with their own conclusion. We shall prevail.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
Like a couple of things. Actually, not just a couple of things. Three things I want to talk about. The first is, if you see this ad, right? This ad is not something that a lot of people will understand. So I'll just give a context to this ad. This ad is inspired from a book from George Orwell, 1984. And this ad was released in 1984. So very poetic in a sense, right? The second thing, the book is all about, if you have seen a movie like V for Vendetta, right? The movie is all about dystopian society where the big boss is watching everybody, right? And everybody has to abide by the rules and everything. So which means a very big power is actually trying to suppress the smaller powers, right? And the reason Apple went ahead with it, and this was actually called one of the best campaigns in the history of Super Bowl campaigns, right? The reason was because it gets people talking, obviously, but it also sets a very kind of good positioning of Apple in people's minds. So IBM was the big boss that they were referring to. IBM was a behemoth in computer industry, and Apple wanted to be that, have that cool, rebellious attitude, and they wanted to create that positioning for themselves. And when you pick a fight with a bigger guy, I think people root for you. That's a human nature. So Apple, actually, it's a very beautiful case study, and I would urge you to go and read more, because it's a master class in marketing. I think Steve Jobs was one of the best marketing geniuses we have seen in last century. Uh, uh, and those are the two things. And the third thing is, if you see the positioning, this will be appreciated by very few people. And Apple also wanted that at that time, because they were actually building very expensive computers, right? Something which a programmer will use, something which a university will use. So all these, I think, programmers, they like to see themselves as pirates and rebels and all. So it actually fits into that narrative very beautifully. And even now, I think Apple has that cool tech image, right? And very premium image. And they have maintained that for last 20, 30 years. So this is basically repositioning the competition subtly. They have not taken the name of IBM or anything, but I think people get the reference. The second one is, I think 20 years apart, Airbnb. Airbnb started, and if you see the hotel, like I just went to Hilton, and am I still? Okay. Sorry. I hope you guys can hear me. Okay. So, so it started with forget hotels. It went to travel like a human, and then belong anywhere, right? So see all the emotions they're trying to evoke. It's a very different storytelling, very different positioning. And if you hear Brian Chesky, who is the CEO of Airbnb, I think he talks a lot around storytelling. He is a designer himself, and he understands the emotions that design evokes in people. So all they have done is actually subtly reposition themselves, actually reposition hotels as something which is very transactional, which is not local, which does not have a very good cultural flavor. And Airbnb is something like you can live with the host, you can hear the local stories, you can feel like a local and all that. So this is another case of very strong positioning. Today, people don't compare hotels versus Airbnb, right? Uh, to start with, they actually started with pricing, but now people are like, Airbnb is a good experience, better experience, and all that. So somehow that storytelling has penetrated in people's mind, right? So I think this was the whole this was the whole thing about uh, the work now coming to you, positioning you for your career. This is a song I love. This is GIF from that, another brick in the wall. I never wanted to be one, but yeah, life happens. I'm still trying to not to be one, right? What I'll do is I'll start a poll, another poll, which is a very simple poll. Have you defined your positioning, your positioning, like personal positioning in the past, right? The poll is in the progress. It is anonymous, so I don't know what you are saying. So please feel free to vote very quickly. 60% people have voted. Interesting. So almost, I think 75% people are not sure. I'm ending this poll, 80% voted. 75% people are either no or not sure, right? Interesting. So I think then this can actually help you, right? And I'll just put a caution out there that sometimes it may sound thoda gyan, right? But bear with me. I think this whole exercise has actually helped me position myself in my career. So I'm just trying to transfer that knowledge to you guys. So it is possible, right? But people are making the same mistakes as products. They're trying to be everything. Like you are in product, so you want to be a product manager who has worked on data, who has worked on consumer experience, who has worked on supply chain. You try to do everything, right? You're a marketer. You want to kind of explore all marketing channels. You want to explore Facebook, TikTok. You want to explore offline marketing. You also want to do brand and all that, right? So you are trying to be too much in a too little time, right? And we also have this belief, which actually stops us from trying to create our positioning, right? Which is, I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum. Descartes wrote this. But if you think about it, right, what we believe is two basic things. One is we feel that sometimes we don't want people's opinion. I am who I am, right? This is what I hear from a lot of people. And the second thing that I hear is self-promotion is cringy. Like, I don't like it. It's weird. Why should I promote myself, right? And you should not, right? People should. And which is where this positioning comes into picture, that people are actually trying to tell other people about you. You are not, and the reason they're telling you is also because you are much more sorted in what you do and they know about it than most of us are. So I'll just change that code to people think therefore you are, not I think therefore I am. Let's get into that mind space and try to think through things. So again, you have to check your positioning. It's very simple. Why would somebody tell others? This first question is very important. Why would they tell, right? If you are a product manager or a marketer, why would they tell? There has to be something distinctive, right? Because of which they will tell, oh, this guy is a ninja in Facebook marketing. He reduced our costs by like 70, 80%. Or this guy grew our whole marketing team from 5 people to 50 people or whatever, right? But there has to be something distinctive about you. Not very generic, distinctive about you, which is why people will tell you about you. And then what will they tell about you? This goes to both negative and positive, right? So negatives are not that bad actually. If somebody is saying that this person is rude, it could also mean they are very straightforward. And certain other people actually like it. Like I, for most of my career, have been very rude guy, and I'm not proud of that. I think when you are young, you are very arrogant, and that also happened with me. But I think that also helped me in certain ways, which is like I could talk to founders without hiding anything. And founders used to trust. Founders actually trust people who can tell what is wrong with the company, right? And that actually helped me, luckily. Over time, I learned that it's also important to maintain relationships and all. And I have made progress on that front. So again, it has to be a framework, right? It cannot be like, okay, all this GAN and then nothing tangible, right? So what I would ask is a series of questions, right? One is, what track are you optimizing for? We all have an end goal, right? I want to be a CPO, I want to be a CMO, I want to be a CXO, I want to be a CEO, right? I want to be a VP, SVP, whatever. Like there is a track in your mind that you're optimizing for. That is the end goal, right? Then mapping the skills to this track. Now this is again an exercise we often don't do. We feel that if we are doing our job day in, day out, it will somehow take care of itself. If we are performing good in our job, we will keep moving. The problem with that mentality is what got you here won't get you there. So you're a very good IC, individual contributor. You can become a manager, but manager requires a very different skill sets. A VP requires a very different skill sets, and a founder requires a very different skill sets. So if you are good in your job right now, that does not mean that you are preparing yourself for the track that you're optimizing for. So that's first thing I would like to say, right? Then once you have these skills listed for that track, like that VP or CEO or CXO, think about which skills do you have, right? And then I'm introducing a very interesting question, which is what is your durable advantage? I will talk about durable advantage. Uh, Durable advantage is something which actually made me leave a company. I won't take the name, but I read this from Paul Graham, which is it's very hard to beat someone at something they enjoy, and if you don't, right? So we all know that do things you love, and the reason is if you love something, love doing something, people will find it very hard to outcompete you. Like because you are doing that without money, without anything. You just enjoy it, so you're going to keep doing it even if there is no incentive. Whereas other people will do it only when there is an incentive, right? So you'll definitely beat other people. So this is do things you love is always said in a positive context, which is like writing, dancing, software programming, and all that. But what I never realized it's also true about the other things like politics, meanness, and other things like people like to gossip, right? Uh, those things also, if people enjoy it and you don't, it's very hard for you to kind of succeed in office politics or other things, right? And which is why, like, if you have to kind of evaluate your strengths and act accordingly. Some of us are very good with relationships and kind of trying to play along with politics. I think most of the people who say that there's no office politics are the people who are very good at politics, right? So I think what you need to identify is both your strengths and weaknesses and how it maps to the track you're optimizing for, right? And your durable advantage is something that you enjoy. It could be on either sides. I'm not a saint, so I won't judge. And the easiest way to find this is, like I said, if you get all the money today, sitting here in this webinar, what is something that you are going to do for the rest of your life? The answer to that question, like, don't just say I will just retire and all. Try to figure out how would a day-to-day life look like. Will you start your day by reading books? Will you start your day by going for hunting? Will you start your day by doing some philanthropy, right? What will that thing look like on a day-to-day basis? How would the day look like? And then you know what are the activities that you actually enjoy. And those, if they can map to this, some of the skills, that becomes your durable advantage. Now, enough theory. Let me come to the positioning exercise, right? So suppose you're optimizing for a track of CPO, right? Which is Chief Product Officer, highest kind of position in a product vertical. Now, skills required for this is product leadership, and product leadership actually is an evolving stage. So you start managing your product, then you manage an organization, which is organization of PMs, then you start managing the company, right? So it's a ladder, right? There's thought leadership, which is like people are willing to listen to what you say because you have something meaningful to say. Then there's business strategy, technical, growth, design, consumer, industry knowledge, creative. I won't go into all of the details because there are a lot of other folks also there, but you see how the skills look like, right? These are very tangible skills and you can always rate yourself on these skills. Now, if I'm doing this for one of my friends or for myself, let me put myself out there, right? I know that I have managed teams. So at an org level, I have built teams and managed teams. So people leadership is my current skill. Thought leadership, I'm trying to work on, right? This is one of the exercises for thought leadership. Because it won't come unless I know a field in and out very well and better than most of others. Business strategy is something I know because I keep reading about business. I don't have an MBA, but I love reading. So anyway, that will come later. Growth is something I'm interested, I've worked on. Consumer and industry knowledge again comes from reading. Now I'll just take a moment of my durable advantages, right? I love reading and writing. As long as I remember, I used to read. I just read. I was actually born in a village with no electricity. That sounds, I don't know, like that sounds very old. But for first 10 years of my life, I was living in a village with no electricity. And I loved reading. I could read all the novels that were available to me at that time, right? Uh, and then I moved to my hostel and all, and the reading habit continued. Like by 10th, I had read most of the Hindi literature, like Premchand, Harivansh Rai Bachchan, everyone, right? Because it was a Hindi medium school. And then I moved to JEE preparation, everything was around JEE, but then I moved to college. And for 4 years, I read self-help books. and they don't help in case you are reading. And then I moved to this job, professional reading, right? Non-fiction, like around business, around growth, around product, tech, everything. So that is something that is a durable advantage for me because I love it. Like if I have free time, I do it, right? The second one that I love is meeting smart people and discussing ideas. The reason I'm doing this whole thing is because I can build a community of super smart people, right? Third is running. And the way I see running is it's something where you push your limits. So normally if you're a very competitive person, you would love running because then you'll stop competing with the external world. You'll start competing with yourself. So it's always good for your health. You can actually focus all your energy into running. And then if you go back to the skills, right? If you see people, thought leadership, business strategy, growth, consumer industry knowledge, all this ties to my reading habit. That is, I think, the durable advantage that I have. And that is not going to change throughout my life because I'm going to do it because I love it, right? So then you map these skills to your possible careers also. Like I started with one track, but I can say that you can actually think about multiple tracks that are possible because of the durable advantages that you have, right? So things can be like VC, because they have to keep reading, they have to keep updating themselves on the knowledge of the industry and all. Maybe head of product and growth, maybe become a teacher. Just I think I love talking to people. I love giving fundas and all. So maybe become a teacher. CEO is a maybe because I don't know like if these advantages translate into a CEO track. There are a lot of other things that I have to figure out before I can say that that is a track which I'm aiming for 20, 30 years down the line. Now, I think this is done. All you need is luck. See, I think you have done this tracks, skills, your skills, and then your durable advantages. This exercise you are done. Now all you need is luck. Because a lot of times what we do is we assign all the successes to ourselves and all the failures to our misfortunes, right? That's the reality. And when I'm talking about somebody else, I will actually assign the failures to them and their successes to luck. The reality is very different. I think we all have a fair share of luck, right? Now what I'm going to claim will sound slightly out of the world, which is you can actually manufacture luck, right? Because you'll need luck. So that is something which is, you can say a principle that is not going to change. That is law of nature, right? But you can manufacture luck in your career. And yeah, this is Tony Stark. He manufactured luck. He was just lucky to be with the guy who posed him to build this suit and everything. Anyway, so before we go, I think there are 4 kinds of luck. I'll take just 5 minutes to conclude this session and then we can move to Q&A. 4 kinds of luck, right? First is what we talk about, what we all wish for, like win a lottery, that's a blind luck. Second is luck due to motion. Hustle, 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 right? There's a reason startups are always telling people to hustle. And the reason is if you keep going on, there are chances that you might stumble on something which is lucky, which is called lucky. Like if you keep meeting people, you might meet somebody who becomes your manager someday or a mentor someday. But if you keep sitting at your home, that is not going to happen. So luck due to motion is a real thing. The third is preparation meets opportunity. And this is how, think of it like, I think one of the best inventions of last century happened when preparation meets opportunity, which is like Louis Pasteur inventing penicillin. And he also made this quote, which is luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. And it was not that he had not thought about it. There was a 10 years period in which he actually covered the journey to discover penicillin. And he was actually luckily, I think when he was ill, some of the nose drips actually fell into the culture dish and the bacteria died and all that, right? So, and the next time it happened, he actually related to the past experience. He said there must be something, which is like we can actually build antibiotics using bacteria, right? So that was a third kind of luck, because if you are prepared and if you are doing hustling, right? If you combine 2 and 3, it becomes very clear that you can get lucky, right? And the fourth one is what I love, right? Which is being your best at something, and then call it luck. So think of it like this: if you are the best scuba diver in the world, right? And if somebody finds, if some person, any person in the world finds a ship location which has all this money, all this like coins and jewels and everything into it, who are they going to contact? They're trying to find the best scuba diver or best diver that is there, right? So if you become best in what you do, right, and if you create that positioning in the market, you are going to get definitely lucky. So this is a short way to kind of manufacture luck. For example, hypothetically, let's say if I become the best growth guy in India, right? Now there are serial entrepreneurs who are going to start their next startup, and they're going to get funds for that. My hypothesis is they will reach me out and they will say, okay, if I want to join them in their mission, right? And that is luck. In a way, that is luck, but that is a luck that you have made yourself, right? Similar for any other, if you are the best marketer, if you're the best brand marketer, I think, I know one of my friends, right? Abhinav Chikara, he's currently doing his startup, but he was in an academy as head of design. He actually graduated in 2015. He was working at Housing with me on a particular project. And I love the guy. He's, I think, one of the best designers I have met. And he was just a fresher, right? And over time, I think Gaurav Munjal, who is the founder of Unacademy, I saw his Facebook post where he asked, like, who is the best designer you know, right? And he said that don't mention Suvanil Chatterjee. I also worked with Suvanil at Housing, right? He was head of design. Don't mention Suvanil, tell me some other names. And fast forward, I think 1 year, 6 months, Abhinav is actually heading design in Unacademy, right? And the reason is he was able to establish himself as one of the best designers at Housing. And people knew that Housing design team is pretty good, right? So you can call it luck that, oh, in 3 years down the line, in 3 years of his career, in first 3 years, he became a head of design at Unacademy, and then Unacademy is now going to become a unicorn and all, right? But it's not luck. He has actually manufactured luck by motion, by preparation, and then finally by becoming some best at something, right? And then I think the ingredients for this luck, right? Obviously, this is all about you, right? But there are other ingredients of luck, which actually help you get lucky. And this is something that, see, we in India, Indian kids are brought up by saying that if you work well, you'll do well in life. And if you work extra hard, you'll do very well in life. Unfortunately, because now we are adults, we know that is not true. There's a fair share of luck, bad luck in whatever happens. And obviously you cannot control everything, but there are ingredients which you can control and you can work on. The first one is, where is your company going? This is the first ingredient. If your company is not going anywhere and you're happy there, maybe you need to reevaluate. Your industry, where is it going? Are you a part of industry that is dying? Are you a part of IBM in 1960s? Or are you a part of IBM in 2015, right? Both are very different things. So where is this industry and company is going? I think being a part of IBM is still good, but if you're a part of Xerox in 1990s or Kodak in 1990s, I think you understand what I'm saying, right? Third, and this is the most important one, your boss, where is he or she going, right? And the second question is, will they take you with them? Because that is also important. If they are going places, you are going places. And this is something which is definitely in your control, right? So choose your boss very carefully. Your business friends, not the friends you hang out with and have chai with in office, but your business friends, people whom you help in general and who will help you in return, right? And the problem that I see in business friends is you only reach out when you have some work, right? Don't do that. Like, try to meet people once in a while, try to send them some good article. I think we are blessed with technology. Dunbar number actually does not follow the rule of technology. Like the technology has actually surpassed Dunbar number, which is you can only be in contact with fixed number of people. Now you can be in contact with hundreds of people. You can forward them useful messages. You can forward them useful articles for their development, and they will actually adore you. They will actually help you when the time comes for you, right? So make some business friends. And then your mentor. Now this is very hard to find, right? So first thing is, if you ask somebody to be your mentor, the conversation is gone. Don't ask somebody to be your mentor. Let it be organic. Like just keep having conversations with them. Keep asking advice from them, and over time they'll become your mentor, right? Now this should not be your manager. Manager and mentor are very different things, because mentor has your interest at their mind. Manager has the company and org interest at their mind. So never the same thing. Never make your manager your mentor. They should be candid and caring, which is like your self-interest. If somebody cares about you, right, like your mom, dad, your brother, they're very frank with you. Okay, this is not good. This is good, right? And they should be years ahead of you. Your mentor cannot be a senior from college 2 years ahead of you. They haven't seen the world, right? How will they explain how things work? They're still trying to figure out, like, so it should be a guy who is at least like 5 to 10 years ahead of you, right? Now 5 to 10 years is just a number. Like in terms of skills, if they are 5 to 10 years ahead of you, please feel free to make them your mentors. So just to conclude, I think we discussed a lot of things, and you can go through this PPT when I share it with you, but make sure your positioning is right. You have durable advantage, and that ties with wherever you are going to go. Be the best in category to manufacture luck, and keep other ingredients of luck in mind: your manager, your mentor, your industry, your company, and everything. And again, Ikigai, I'll just leave this. This does not resonate with a lot of people, just to me, so I'll just skip this. But Ikigai is something where you are doing something you are good at, you love it, the world needs it, and you are paid for it.